The extent to which the Civil War changed political life for African Americans might be best be understood in the context of slavery. The political divide on the idea of whether slavery should be abolished or not led to the secession of Southern states. The secession caused the Civil War. The Northern Union eventually won this Civil War. The period after the Civil War was when the country dealt with the newly free African Americans and the reconstruction of the divided nations. The goal of the reconstructions were to guarantee rights to the Southern slaves and incorporate the Southern states back into the Union. It occurred in 1863 through 1877. The key methods were passing the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to abolish slavery and give the formerly enslaved rights. Although these amendments were made to change the lives of African Americans, their political life was ultimately the same due to the unjust laws to try and limit the freedom of the formerly enslaved African Americans.
After the abolishment of slavery, Southern states created unjust laws to limit the freedom of African Americans and to create unfair working conditions, similar to slavery. A primary example of this is the similarities between the sharecropper contract, a contract containing rules and limitations for free African Americans working on plantations, and the formerly used slave codes, used before the abolishment of slavery. The sharecropper contract similarly tied African Americans to the plantations they worked in. The sharecropper contract stated that no cropper is to work off the plantation when there is any work to be done on the land he has rented, or when his work is needed by me, the landowner, or other croppers. This rule is extremely similar to the North Carolina Black Codes, which state, "No slave shall go off the plantation or seat of land where such slave shall be appointed to live without a certain certificate of leave in writing, for so doing from his or her master or overseer." Both of these rules force African Americans to stay on the plantation unless they are permitted by their landowners. Although they are supposed to be free from slavery, the conditions are nearly the same.
Another example of freed African Americans experiencing similar working conditions to when they were enslaved was the fact that they did not have the right to sell the products that they collected. The sharecropper contract stated that the sale of every cropper part of the cotton to be made by me, the landowner, when and where I choose to sell. This restricts the African American farmer's right to sell crops they farmed. This idea was presented in the Code Nor, Louisiana Slave Code. In the Code Nor is written that a slave cannot sell sugarcane, repeating the idea of African Americans not being able to sell the crops they farmed. This proves that the working conditions are similar because even though they are freed from slavery and are working a paying job, they don't have the right to be in charge of their crops. They are instead used as a form of or farming material just as they were when they were enslaved.
One final example of the similarities between sharecropping and slavery was the requirement for an employed sharecropper to follow their employer's orders. The sharecropping contract states that all croppers must clean out the stable and fill them with straw, and haul straw in front of the stables whenever I direct. This rule requires an African American to listen to what the landowner tells them to do whenever they say to, in the same way in which a slave was required to do what their enslaver told them to do. The document An Act Concerning Servants and Slaves from Virginia in 1705 states that, and if a slave resists his master or owner or other person by his or her orders, correcting such a slave, and shall happen to be killed in such correction. Although a more extreme example, this is an example of a slave having to follow every command of their enslaver. Even though slavery was abolished, the working conditions and requirements of African Americans working on plantations were extremely similar to how they were before the Civil War.
Although slavery was abolished after the Civil War, the sharecropper contract and the slave codes were extremely similar, which proves that their working conditions for African Americans were barely improved after the abolishment of slavery. The political life of an African American was ultimately the same because they were There were many unjust laws being passed to prevent their true freedom. The sharecropper contract is one example, but there were many more, such as poll taxes and literacy tests. The Reconstruction was overall unsuccessful in its goal of guaranteeing the rights of Southern slaves. Freedom.